actually official UFO organizations throughout the world. And the reason most of these organizations got started are because of some pretty incredible UFO encounters or otherwise. So that's what we'll be going over here in this talk. So to begin with just a little bit of background. Now, when I put together this talk, I used to talk about how the United States does not have an official UFO investigation organization currently. However, that is in question because if you read the news, you know a gentleman by the name of Luis Elizondo has come out and said, I have worked for the Pentagon investigating UFOs. Now, the government has said that funding stopped in 2012 and that research doesn't go on. However, Elizondo has said, well, despite the stopping of funding, we still do research. And I still ran that program up until October of 2017. So that program still goes on, and I've been able to see evidence that, yeah, they are still doing that research. We don't know the name of the program anymore. One thing that happens, at least in many governments, if a project, you don't want people to know the name, you change it. So if they figure out the name, you change the name, and now nobody can find it. If you FOIA it, it's difficult to get it to. So that's what they've done. So we don't know the name of the program, but I think that in the news we're learning more and more, and we'll probably learn that pretty soon. And I have some connections as to why I can say that. And if you hang out here, my next presentation will be about that. So I'll be talking more about that current program. However, before December 2017, when the New York Times kind of broke that story, or a couple months prior to that when Lou Elizondo came out, the government kept telling us that this was it. You know, this Project Sign, Project Rudge, and Project Blue Book from 1947 till 1969 were the only UFO research that they did. Of course, we've learned that isn't true. So really, they've been telling us false information, surprise, surprise, for decades now. And that's what's kind of fun for those of us in this field, is that we've got government documents, we've been telling people, we've been FOIAing. The government says, we don't investigate UFOs. We show them a document, well, this document says otherwise. Well, we don't investigate UFOs. All right. And when you take that to the public, you know, they're kind of like, well, I see your document, but they say they don't investigate. I don't know. But these days, now it's very eye-opening. Everybody's like, wow, I guess you guys were right. What's really interesting about the research that was done in the United States and why it's important for this conversation is that it was actually a big inspiration for a lot of other governments to investigate UFOs. There are a lot of files out there. You know, one of the quotes is 701 unidentified cases that were part of Project Blue Book. That's significant because there was a period of time where they were really trying to just talk away all the, close all the cases, call them knowns, kind of match them up. That kind of looks like a balloon. We're saying that's a balloon. So to say that there were some that they couldn't even do that with, 700 of them is pretty significant. And if you look through those cases, some of those are great. But the other reason that's important is that the government justified closing the project due to something called the Condon report, many of you may be familiar with. And what they decided is they needed a third party, an independent third party, to do an analysis to determine whether or not they should investigate UFOs anymore. So they went to the University of Colorado. Well, that's what they were trying to sell, but we found out during that investigation that it was kind of an agreement with Dr. Condon, the professor who ran the project, that they were going to find nothing in the first place. They wrote a memo that, to the university saying, don't worry, our goal is to not find anything, but to kind of just show that we did our best efforts to discover something. Now, not all the people that were investigating were on board with this, nor did they know that. In fact, it was a couple of investigators who found this memo that were on the Condon report, who were doing, genuine work that exposed that, and then they got kicked off the committee. But their argument was that we're actually finding a lot of really good stuff. And that Condon report, if you read it, most people who take a look at it discover it to be more of an argument for the phenomena as opposed, and much of the criticism of that document at the time was that Did this Condon guy even read his own report? Because his conclusion does not fit the report whatsoever. But Canada for a period of time had a project called Project Magnet from 1950 to 1962. I say 54 to 62, so it's kind of a little bit similar to what Elizondo said. So this group was officially together from 50 to 52. They determined it was government funded, there was government oversight. In 52, they decided, well, we don't really want to spend money on this anymore. However, one of the guys who was part of this project, who really was kind of the backbone of it, a radio engineer by the name of Wilbert Smith, said, well, I'll just continue to investigate myself if I can still do it under Project Story or Magnet. And they said, okay. So he continued to investigate. Now, there was a defense court from 52 to 54 in Canada that did some investigation, and there are some interesting cases. What's kind of cool about Canada is that they have a website you can go to, and this website is about all their UFO cases, and there's some pretty interesting cases there, and we'll look at one of those in just a second. But this is my favorite. This poster here you can find there also. You can find some American versions of this poster as well. But from 1959 to 1962, this is called a Service Merit, which of course are acronyms, and I can't remember all the words for the acronyms, but essentially what these were is how to report important situations out in the field for pilots and personnel. And you'll notice, if you look at the line of pictures on the far right, it says unidentified flying objects. And you see there's a little rocket, and you also see a disc. So they were supposed to report these things, and these were instructions how. And these were posters that were throughout, all branches of the military, Canada and the United States, showing people this is what you're supposed to report. But one of the great cases from Canada is called the Shag Harbor incident. Some of you may be familiar with it. But I'm going to read you kind of this short summary they have of it. An RNCMP, that's Royal Canadian Mounted Police Corporal, and 6 other witnesses observed what they believed to be an unidentified flying object off the southwest coast of Nova Scotia, Canada, on October 4th, 1967. The object was described as approximately 60 feet in length and was flying in an easterly direction when it was first sighted. During their observation, the UFO descended rapidly to the surface and made a bright splash as it struck the water. For some time after the impact, a single white light remained on the surface. The RCMP corporal endeavored to reach the floating object, but unfortunately, before he could reach the location, the object sank. A search of the area failed to produce any material evidence which could assist in explaining or establishing the identity of the object. An underwater search conducted by divers from the Department of National Defense also failed to locate any tangible evidence which could be used to arrive at an explainable conclusion. So it was a great case. They couldn't figure out what it was. Of course, they thought, well, did a small aircraft crash there, what? But if that would have been the case, they would have found it. But they never did. And in fact, many researchers talked to other witnesses who said they saw that light traveling under the water for a distance. There's actually a website called RoswellProof.com that has a lot of news clippings from the time when this occurred because it made a lot of media attention. So it's a really great case, a really interesting case that remained unsolved, probably the most important Canadian one. And you can find that document I just read from on their website. That's about the extent of Canada's involvement with UFOs officially. Interestingly enough, the United Kingdom, however, has had a long history with working with UFOs. It started in the 1950s. The Ministry of Defense Chief Scientific Advisor, Sir Henry Tizard, he was the one who kind of started this organization called the Flying Saucer Working Party, which is a bunch of scientists to investigate UFOs. They thought there was something to them, but the project didn't really continue until a couple of years later, when the Ministry of Defense started up their UFO project in 1953, which ran until 2009. So a lot of people don't realize they had an official UFO organization for decades. There's someone here doing talks who worked for that program in the 90s, and that's Nick Pope. So one of the speakers actually worked for the UK. In fact, his website is the best resource for this history on the background of how all of this happened. But what's interesting was about the time, a little bit before Nick Pope got involved, there was an Defense Intelligence Staff document that was put together by the UK. It's not like the UK essentially, they investigated UFOs, but like Nick put it, kind of like our government, whenever the media came and asked, they would use what Nick calls spin and dirty tricks. So even though they were investigating, and Nick Pope was a skeptic when he started, but not so much after he started investigating, they didn't want the media to know they were taking this seriously. So by spin and dirty tricks, he would say stuff like, the media would call and say, a bunch of witnesses saw something, here or there. And he would say, well, no, we didn't find any little green men, or there's no little green men in London, or some kind of joke. And then the media would use that quote, and because there's not something really substantial typically that the media person would have, then that's they would set the tone for the articles and then for the tone for how people would treat the phenomena. So they weren't really forthcoming. In fact, they ended the program, they started in about 2005, they said, well, we get the #1 request for our version of FOIA in the UK is for UFO files, so we're gonna release all the files. So they started releasing tons of files in batches over the years. 2008 came and they said, okay, we're about to release our last batches and we're no longer gonna investigate UFOs. Don't call us if you see a UFO. And they sent this across all of the military, all the branches, which is kind of silly. I mean, if you're seeing something in our airspace, especially airspace that's either military or commercial, you'd think someone would want to know, that they would want to investigate it. It might not be, an ET spacecraft, but it could be drug runners, it could be a foreign object. So it seems kind of irresponsible to have done that. But Nick Pope says he thinks that they just had other ways of gathering those reports, and they just felt they didn't need the public's input anymore on that. So kind of interesting. But of course, do you think they released all the files? No. Soon after they released all their files, researchers said, well, wait a second. You said you released all your files, but what about this file? What about that file? What about all these files you told us you were going to release? So they had to admit, okay, well, we forgot those ones. And over the years, slowly they've released 1 or 2 or 3 that here and there. So have we seen them all yet? Probably not. We might not ever, but they have released a lot of great cases. What's interesting is they did do a document in 1995, the Defense Intelligence Staff, like I was mentioning earlier, and their conclusions in this document I think are kind of fun. They seem very British, and occasionally through this talk I'll attempt to do accents from the different countries, and they're going to be very poor, I'll warn you that right now. But I'm not going to start right now either, because this is a tough one. Oh, I might. But they said, if the sightings are of devices not of the Earth, then their purpose needs to be established as a matter of priority. There have been no apparent hostile intent, and other possibilities are military reconnaissance, scientific, or tourism. Seems very practical. As the British love to tour the rest of the world, they figure, why wouldn't the aliens want to come and tour, or would they have a holiday on Earth? Look at the little hairless monkeys. They're quite entertaining. So, so that's kind of the history of the UK. So they haven't been necessarily that forthcoming, but they were proactive in that they had an organization from the 50s until 2009, and perhaps, like we've discovered here, we'll find out that they did have a program. But the largest Western country, essentially, with an ongoing UFO organization has been France. And it's an organization called GEIPAN, which is really fun to say. GEIPAN. So after World War II, you don't have to read all this. Like I said, it's a collection of notes, and words are boring, but I'll tell you all the exciting stuff. But after World War II, they did begin, kind of like the Americans and other countries, gathering UFO reports, because it was really after World War II that all the countries started getting reports. In fact, there are lots of reports during World War II. Some people think that's maybe because of nukes, or maybe because it was such a large war that somebody else began to get interested in what us hairy monkeys are up to. But in the 1950s, the Germande, or gendarme, I always have a hard problem with it. And lots of countries, what was that? Gendarme. Ooh, you say it very nice. Gendarme. See? The gendarme. But gendarme are there's a lot of countries with an organization like this. They're a federal policing organization. They're kind of like ICE. ICE just focuses on a couple things, whereas this kind of federal organization has a bigger jurisdiction and focuses on more. So they were taking them seriously. In 1967, there was a gentleman who started up an inquiry for UFOs, and their goal was to check on the probability of whether they exist, and also to include the search for extraterrestrial life, what our relation could be with them through space, and what is going on in our terrestrial environment. In other words, the study of UFOs. This is interesting because, they were taking a little bit more of a research aspect to it. That's what's interesting about France. Their UFO research has mostly been a part of their CNES, which is their space program. So it's kind of like NASA. Whereas most other organizations, it's been the military looking for that. One of the cases that was a big case that influenced the president to start to look into all of the UFO activity was this one in Tenerife, Madagascar. So this is the capital, and Madagascar at the time was a French colony. But this is a great case. On August 15th in 1954 at 5 p.m., an electric green ball, like you see in this picture, was seen descending towards the ground, and everyone watched as it dropped behind the hill. And what I mean by everybody is, Tenerife is a city where there's lots of shopping and everything, and back then there weren't malls, so we don't shop inside. Everybody's shopping on the street. And I'll show you some pictures of some of these markets. Well, I could show you one here. So they have these busy outdoor markets. So thousands of people are outside, and thousands, it's estimated possibly hundreds of thousands of people saw this. So this giant green ball is falling from the sky, and everybody's watching because they're expecting some big explosion. But that never happened. What happened instead is this UFO reappeared, and supposedly it circled around the town with sparks coming out behind it. It was also followed by a silvery metallic football-looking object. They said that the shop's lights died out as the object went around. Animals howled and barked and seemed to be in a state of panic, and then the object flew off to the west and was seen by farms along the way. And again, the animals were reacting to it. Many people saw it. The number of witnesses were estimated to be 200,000 people. So a big deal. This is what the markets look like. That's kind of what the town looks like now. But yeah, this was a really big deal. However, the project did not continue because at the end of May and June of 1968, when this was beginning, there was a big, essentially there was kind of a mini coup in France, and the president had to flee the country, and a lot of the issues were around the spending of money, and so they just didn't want to start up a new project at a time like this. But later on, a new project was started. There was a new wave of sightings in 1973, and at the time, the reports began to be sent to CNES, the space program. Inside of the space program then was an engineer called Claude Poher, and this is him right here. And he got all these UFO cases, and he decided, I know the Americans have been looking into UFOs, so what did they find? He read the Condon report, and he discovered just what I told you all earlier. He was like, this Condon report is not debunking UFOs. If you read it, it supports it. So he was then convinced, wow, there's something to this phenomena, largely by the Condon report. He then put together a statistical study of those reports that they had gotten in CNES. He worked together with Jacques Vallée. Many of you know who he is, a astronomer who would work with the real Dr. Paul Hynek, who you see in the Project Blue Book television show. And they worked together and put together this report. Then in 1967, with the support of the Institute of Advanced Studies, they were able to put together a UFO group. They worked together with the Air Force, the gendarme. The gendarme. I gotta get that down because it's such a cool word, the gendarme. I want to work for the gendarme. I am an agent of the gendarme. Have you seen any UFOs? But they worked together with Civil Aviation and the National Meteorological Office. So yeah, then they started up their formal UFO group, GEIPAN. At first, it was a staff of about 6 to 7 people, and there was a scientific council that they reported to, and they had to make reports every year to this scientific council. However, they don't really have FOIA in France like we have here, and so those reports are all secret. We haven't seen any of those reports. However, in 1978, they did send out a study that said that they had 678 reports by then. 26% were categorized as identified, perfectly identified in fact, probably identified. 36% were insufficient information, and the remaining 38% were unidentified. So 40% of their cases they couldn't identify. They then held a gathering with civilians and UFO organizations to discuss this, and really they even got more determined about UFOs and investigating them at this time. It's kind of funny because France is actually, they're very careful about their science, and there's a lot of criticism of this organization. So they try to be very scientific and careful in their investigations. This report here, Trans in Provence, which occurred in 1981, was one of the most popular cases because it had some scientific evidence. The witness was a farmer, and you can kind of see a picture of what he saw here. He was 55 when he says a UFO landed on his property and then took off immediately. He thought it was a military experiment, so he notified the local gendarme, and I did pretty good. They interviewed him, collected soil and plant samples, and they actually found something there. In fact, here is kind of a page on the GEIPAN site that talks about the final report. But this scientist here, who does look very French, even got the collar there. But his name is Michael Boneas, and he works for the National Institute of Agronomy Research, which is plant related. His conclusion on this report was, it was not the aim of the author to identify the exact nature of the phenomenon observed on the 8th of January 1981 at Trans in Provence, but it can reasonably be concluded that something unusual did occur that might be consistent, for instance, with an electromagnetic source of stress. So they look for physiological cases, and you'll notice they have several physiological cases that have this electromagnetic field issue. And that is something that has been found along in other research, even here like with the Mutual UFO Network or others, where in the cases where they have been able to test some areas where something strange has occurred, they do find an electromagnetic effect on the plants. One of those cases, for instance, is called La Amarante, which is you see on the list here. This took place in 1982 in the town of Nancy. This case was significant because the eyewitness was a biologist, so he was considered highly reliable. He was a respected biologist. And there was the effects to vegetation. What happened was he was in his garden, and he saw an ovoid object which silently descended into his object. It hovered about 3 feet above the ground for a small period of time, and it was small. It was a small object. He says, then it rose up, and when it rose up, the vegetation under the object also rose up. And that effect is determined to be from an electromagnetic energy, because they tested the plants and found that. So that was another important case for them in France that has kind of kept the program running. Really, this just shows a little bit about, they actually, kind of like earlier I had mentioned where if a government program, they want to hide it, they change their name. That happened during a period of time. They were getting a lot of criticism, so they changed the name and said, you know, they're just investigating satellites and things like that, when, you know, behind the scenes they really were still looking into UFOs. Later on, when it became more palatable to the public, in 2005, they changed the name back to GEIPAN. But there's also something significant that happened. Some of you may have heard of the Cometa report, and it's considered an important report in ufology, but this report is not a French government report, which many people assume. However, it was it was an organization made up of a lot of former government people. So, for example, there was an Air Force general that was part of this, their director of Air France, a squadron commander for their Air Force, an Air Force general. All of these guys worked together because they believed that there was something to the phenomena and put together a report. Their final conclusion was that the accumulation of well-documented sightings made by credible witnesses forces us to consider from now on all of the hypotheses regarding the origin of unidentified flying objects or UFOs and the extraterrestrial hypothesis in particular. And this was written by the head of the Cometa Committee, who was French Air Force General Denis Letty. So they take it very seriously. There is an organization in France of aeronautical engineers that actually is UFO based, and they work with a lot of the UFO organizations here in the United States and some of these others. But if you go to the website for GEIPAN right now, you can see this pie chart. They've got it right on the front page, and it'll show you how many cases they've got, how many cases they've studied, and how many that they feel are unidentified. And it's a pretty large percentage, because most organizations, you know, the unidentifieds are in the anywhere from 3 to 10%, but theirs can be larger. So it's really interesting. A few years ago, I was able to interview Javier Passot, who is who was running GEIPAN at the time.
In France, we are a civil institute. Our goal is not to protect the country. Our goal is to try to understand this phenomenon and to try to reply to the French population, to explain what can be. We open roughly 200 folders per year, and among that, we can say that about 10% in the recent years, let's say 20 reports per year, would be classified as unidentified.
And they make a big point that, you know, there's heavy oversight into what they do because they're part of their space organization, and there's a lot of course, skeptics in their scientific community. So their results are heavily scrutinized. So yeah, GEIPAN, a great organization, and it is interesting to note, like he said, this is a scientific organization, part of their space program as opposed to their military. Now the rest of the organizations we're going to talk about are mostly in South America, interestingly enough. There's just a different culture, and they take this stuff much more seriously. One of the first is called Crit OVNI. Now OVNI is a term that you hear a lot in countries that, you know, have Latin-based languages. They use it in French, Italian, and Spanish. It's essentially an object, moving objects that's not identified. I can attempt one of these. Let's see, in French it's objet volant non identifié. In Italian it's oggetto volante non identificado. Or in Spanish it's objeto volador no identificado. That's exactly how they say it. So, Credovni is in Uruguay. They started up an organization. Their goal is to look at what is the likelihood of fraud on the part of the witnesses, what is the possibility of fraud by third parties. So, and for example, maybe somebody launched a balloon and fooled a bunch of people, and so it was a fraud by third party. How likely is it a conventional phenomenon, you know, just maybe a secret spacecraft or aircraft? What chances are they physiological illusion, and how likely is it unconventional phenomenon? This is a guy who runs that program. He's Colonel Ariel Sanchez, and at Open Minds, website that I run, we were able to interview him in December 2012. Actually, I think it was Antonio Punez, one of the guys who worked with. He said they had over 1,200 cases that they've investigated. 3% are unsolved. These are the cases we refer to as unconventional or simply UFOs, says Colonel Sanchez. Some of their famous cases regard fighters, sort of things, but let me get to, this was a case that they debunked. This was a very popular photo from a soccer match or a football match in their country. This is what the object looks like, but they were able to, and this was them kind of justifying, hey, this is why the scientific method is important. They were able to show that this was just a promotional balloon at the soccer game. But he has some interesting perspectives. He says the UFO phenomena is recognized by the Uruguayan Air Force as a real phenomenon. Its point of origin is unknown, and we don't know if it's a lower atmosphere phenomena that we haven't cataloged yet, a physical phenomena, or if there's a possibility of someone sending a probe to our system, to our planet, just as we are sending probes to Mars and other parts of our planetary systems. The Air Force doesn't rule out the extraterrestrial hypothesis, but personally, I'm inclined to believe in a closer hypothesis, that of a superior intelligence interacting with us in these unidentified objects. From where they come from or how they get here, I don't know, but we are seeing them, we are photographing them, we have chased and tried to grab them in order to identify them, but without success. He's also said he thinks maybe they're people that have been here all along, maybe they're multidimensional, which is a great perspective, I think, to have an open mind about what the possibilities may be. The most important, probably, organization out there besides GEIPAN is Chile's CEPA, and they make a point, even though normally you might say CEPA, they like to pronounce both the A's. They say no, it's CEPA. So that stands for the Committee for the Study of Aerial Anomalous Phenomena. It is more of a military-based case or organization, but they work with everyone. One of the popular cases that got them started was in 1997, and 3 UFOs were seen by a control tower from the International Airport of Chacabuta. It was confirmed on radar at 10,000 to 15,000 feet and tracked at speeds up to 8,000 miles per hour. They were spotted on the beach, and they emitted a blue, green, and red light. And according to their news, Airport Chief Julio Schneider said that the experience was wonderful. He was a skeptic about UFOs, but not anymore. He's also stated that they moved at an astonishing speed. And he didn't see this. He was from the airport. He was actually at the beach with his family, and he saw these lights, and it made him believe that there was something to them. This is General Bermudez, who luckily we've been able to talk to quite a bit, who runs the program. He says they have support from all the branches of their military and their police. They liaison with Uruguay's Credovni and France's GEIPAN. He says he was skeptical at first until the Alpha Pelican case in June 23, 2010. 3 planes were bound for the Arturo Marina Benitez Airport. 2 craft reported UFOs at 4,000 feet simultaneously, and soon after, a military aircraft reported seeing the same object at 300 feet. He told us, think for a moment. If one experienced commercial pilot reports to me that something flew across in front of his airplane, I pay careful attention. But now if a second commercial pilot reports the same a few seconds later, I become more interested. But if a third pilot, a military one, confirms the same fact, I tend to believe it. In this case, do we have one UFO close to the airplanes, or we have two UFOs? If it's one, it moves at incredible speed and it doesn't correspond to anything we have now. So there's a couple other things Chile's done that's really cool, but their attitude in Chile is much different than the United States. We asked Jose Ley about that. He's the International Affairs Director, and here's what he told us.
They don't get embarrassed, not at all. There is no ridicule on the subject. If you think that 85% of the population believes in the phenomena, it is impossible to actually try to ridicule. Now we do have plenty of what you may call debunkers, but they are slowly dying out because they make no sense.
Yeah, so people are very open there. In fact, mostly they come to the table with the idea that, you know, there's a real phenomena going on. He says their goals are, we don't know where they are or what they are or where they come from. It's necessary to continue studying them, and it's necessary to share all that information. That's something that's really interesting. In fact, General Bermudez spoke at our UFO Congress, an event that Open Minds put on, and now that I put on with Karen downstairs, but he says the way they approach this is what he calls a transparency law. This is a way we deal with the phenomena open and freely. They share everything they find. This is Leslie Kean. So this is really interesting. They love Leslie. So Leslie Kean is a great journalist. Pretty much everything she writes for the Huffington Post, but she's written for the New York Times also more recently. Everything she posts becomes a big deal and goes viral because she's very careful about writing about the credible aspects of this phenomenon. In fact, the article in the New York Times that broke the story that the Pentagon had a UFO program, this one from December 2017, was generated by her. She was one of the authors of that article and the one who started to fight to get that article into the New York Times. But when she visits Chile, she's received like a rock star, like you can see here. In fact, here's her at a briefing, and these are all very high-level generals and officials, and her right in front with everyone. And you can see Jose Ley there also to her left and our right. So it's taken very, very seriously. They have these briefings occasionally about the phenomena. One of the more interesting briefings they've had, and this is unique for any country, is this one here. The Chilean government decided to have a meeting about, you know, what is the nature? What do these things want? Do we need to be afraid? Leslie wrote a story on this, and she said, among the DGAC specialists, the DGAC is similar to their FAA, and most of the officials are military officials and essentially FAA officials at this meeting. But they were there from different branches of the Armed Force and police corps were also present, but all of them, including a Navy commander who's in charge of flight security for naval aviation, and also a pilot, all of them were mostly pilots, along with Bermudez, who we saw earlier, who was a combat pilot. But their conclusion was that based on the evaluation at the meeting, the committee concluded that UAP, the new word for UFOs, do not present a threat or a danger to air operations, either civilian or military. Although there have been a small number of accidents attributed to UAP around the world, none have withstood an objective examination that presented unmistakable proof that UAP were the cause. So they don't believe there is anything necessarily to fear because they haven't been confronted. They just seem to be buzzing around and checking them out. In fact, they stated during the meeting that the biggest danger posed by the UFOs is pilots getting distracted by looking at them, and they actually advise that they, you know, let everybody, all the pilots know, hey, you see a UFO, pay attention to the road, you know, don't get too distracted by it. Peru also has an office. It started in 2001. It closed for a period of time due to lack of funds and then reopened in 2013. What's interesting about this is that, I talked earlier about the ATIP program, or that program at the Pentagon that was investigating UFOs and how they lost their funding in 2012. But Lou Elizondo says we continue to investigate. That isn't so strange. That happens. In fact, that's what happened here. When a program is open, just because they lose funding doesn't mean the program's closed. It just means, of course, they have much less resources to do anything. So sometimes in these other countries, individuals take on those tasks, like Wilbur Smith in Canada, or they just are dormant for a period of time until something happens that they can continue to start doing work again and get more money. That's essentially what Lou said happened here in the United States. He would just work without funding on these programs. So it went dormant from 2015 to 2013, but it is part of their U.S. Air Force Space Command. So we actually have a U.S. Air Force Space Command. So my point is not that they're part of our U.S. Air Force Space Command, but an equivalent agency that they have over there in Peru. So there's been a lot of news about the Space Command. It's kind of funny because, it's the Space Force thing. They're like, oh, we need a new Space Force. So they created the Space Force. But a lot of people were like, well, we actually have an Air Force Space Command. So they're like, oh, well, we're establishing this thing. Anyway, they established it. Guess who's in charge of it? The guy who runs Air Force Space Command. Guess where it's housed? At the offices of the guy who runs the Air Force Space Command. So really, it was kind of rhetorical, it's kind of rhetoric, this latest kind of thing. But essentially, the point was there's a lot going on in space and we need more defense, especially because I think, it's been in the news, China and others are making these satellite killers, and we need to be ready for that because no country more than the United States relies on satellites more than we do. But anyway, that's essentially where this department lies. And they've had a lot of great cases. The guy who runs the program is named Julio Chamorro Flores. And he was part of a really great case in the past. So actually, let's show you that. So this is called the La Jolla case, Dogfight with UFOs. So the case was publicized in a declassified document, actually, by the United States Defense Intelligence Agency. So this is one of those cases where, it happened in 1980, we found this government document, and we're like, look, you researched this case, but you're saying you're not into UFOs. Yeah, we're not. Well, why'd you look at this? Well, we're not into UFOs. That's all you get. But this event took place, and I've got a little video here to show you what it looked like, essentially what happened. The event took place at the La Jolla Air Base in Arequipa, Peru on April 11, 1980. It was 7:15 a.m. and was witnessed by nearly 2,000 people at the base. Chamorro says it was the time of the day when all personnel stand in formation to receive orders, then go to work. So in the morning in Peru, they all get together in the morning and they have kind of a briefing and then they get sent off to do their work. So they were all outside when this occurred. I'll run it again because it's a cool video. But they all saw some sort of craft at the end of a runway. A jet was scrambled, but every time the jet locked onto the object, it would maneuver out of the way. Commander Oscar Santa Maria Huertas piloted the jet that was pursuing the object. It was a Sukhoi 22 jet, for anybody who is a jet nerd. But he says he fired around 60 rounds of 30mm shells at the object, but it had little effect. He says one of the rounds would have blown up a truck, but this object seemed to absorb the bullets. After about 22 minutes of chasing the object, Huertas says he was running out of fuel and he had to return to base. What's interesting about this is that this happens quite a bit. I mean, when you look at the Blue Book files, 1952 over Washington, D.C., if you watch the show Unidentified, the cases that have been revealed lately that have caused the Navy to say that they're taking UFOs seriously, 2004 Nimitz aircraft carrier, 2015 Roosevelt aircraft carrier, it's the same sort of thing. They see these objects, jets are scrambled, they chase the objects, they're outmaneuvered, and then the objects take off at a quick speed. Over and over and over again we see this. And that's what these agencies are experiencing as well. So it's a really cool case. This is Commander Chamorro here. And there were a couple other big cases that they reviewed, but they weren't that exciting. So let's move on, because we've got a lot of other cool stuff. This one's kind of interesting. One of the famous cases that they investigated in 2008 was the Pucallapa case. I'm gonna just call it that. I know I got it wrong. But anyways, this was an 18-year-old in a village who was fishing. And this object came over, beamed some sort of beam down, and it was burning him. So he jumped into the water and actually turned the boat under and stayed over it. The locals said, they felt that this was related to them finding bodies without skin around. And in fact, they named these guys the Pelicaras, or face peelers. So yeah, really scary case. But supposedly all of the villagers, had witnessed some of this, and once the object went away, he ran into town and the villagers came out with guns, but they didn't see anything. There was also a big case that was in the news out there in 2013, where a news crew took video of a UFO, but unfortunately it's really hard to find very good information on those. Argentina started up a program for a short period of time. They said they were starting it in 2011, but they really didn't start it in 2015. The very first report was the last report they sent out, was one report on a UFO. So not much came from Argentina, but they were going to start a program. I don't know what happened with that. But they've had some interesting cases. This case occurred, this was probably one of the biggest. Thousands of people saw this. It was 1 a.m. on Thursday on November 26, 2009. And this was near the town of J.B. Gonzalez. But a lot of people, because it was so hot, were outside even at 1 a.m. eating ice cream and hanging out. When they saw this large object flying around the city, it was described as a huge luminous cigar, and the power went out. There were a couple people fishing actually at a nearby dam here that saw the object. This is what the dam looked like. They said it looked like it kind of like went near the dam and had something went back and forth, and then the power went out. It was out for about 12 hours, and the phones were out also. But researchers were able to track the path of the object to the dam, and that's what you see here. So that was a really big case. That was a good case. So those are the agencies. However, a lot of people are saying, well, a lot of these different countries are saying the UN needs to do something about this. And what's interesting is that the UN did. The UN had a resolution in 1977 to create a UFO investigation organization. And it was started by this person, Sir Eric Gary, who is the Prime Minister of Grenada. He said that he had seen an object himself. He said, I've myself seen an unidentified flying object and have been overwhelmed by what I have seen, but many interested in this matter, our main interest in this matter is not scientific, but essentially political, since I am the firm belief that this world body should take a legitimate interest in a matter which has aroused general worldwide concern, including that of the leaders of several countries. So in 1977, he told the UN this, they started these debates. In the background, I have some documents, we won't go over those in detail, but the British were the most. They were saying, no, we can't do this. This undermines the credibility of the United Nations. The United States was kind of like, we could care either way, but the British were trying to tell the United States, we can't do this. But that was the debate going on in the background, but nothing was really happening until this suave character, Lee Spiegel, whose fashion stylings were inspired by Serpico. He's a good friend of mine now, but he claims that's the case. But you can see it here. But what Lee Spiegel, so essentially what he did, he was a young journalist at the time, And he had gone to CBS and said, hey, you're doing these records on these different issues, kind of like audio documentaries. I want to do one on UFOs. I know some astronauts. I know people who have seen UFOs who would love to talk about them. And they said, okay. They gave him, and back then they had these giant recording devices where they record onto records. So they gave him one of these recording devices and a budget, and he flew around the world. He interviewed astronaut Edgar Mitchell, he interviewed Dr. J. Allen Hynek, Dr. Jacques Vallée, many different people regarding all of this. And when he got back, after he created that record, which was a big success, he saw in the news that Sir Eric Gary was doing this, and he decided, you know what, he needs my help. So he lived in New York. He marched down to the UN and to talk to the Grenadans and said, I want to help out. And they said, okay. And because he had this access, and so his idea was to put on a whole kind of AV presentation at the UN to show that this is really serious and to bring some of these credible witnesses. He said it was a really interesting experience. At the time, Spielberg was creating Close Encounters. Hynek was somewhat involved with that, so they went and visited Spielberg, who helped them and gave them some support and some material. And he also, had a lot going on then. So he got together a lot of really important people, such as Hynek, who was Jacques Vallée I had talked about, but astrophysicist Claude Poher with the French organization, a physiologist named David Saunders, and also astronaut Gordon Cooper. So Hynek had said at the UN, the time has come for official education of the public regarding UFOs. We now recognize that apart from its potential scientific importance, it has sociological and political significance. No doubt Project Blue Book will probably cover this in one of their future episodes, but aliens will probably invade and shoot some of the politicians or something really extraordinary, because they do not necessarily stick to the facts on the show, but they make it very exciting. So with Mimi, like Hynek's wife, getting seduced by a Russian agent. If some of you have been to other alien cons, Paul Hynek, who's J. Allen Hynek's son, has been to many of them, and none of that exciting stuff happened. But here's a picture of that group at the UN. On the far left, you can see Gordon Cooper, one of the first men in space. His sightings were really interesting. He had two things to talk about. When he was in World War II, his squadron was essentially flying one direction, and a squadron of silver objects quickly sped the opposite direction. That was his first-hand experience. Then also when he was working at Edwards Air Force Base on testing different aircraft, he came to work and he had a crew working on an aircraft and at a dry lake bed, and they told him, we just recorded a silver disc come and land on the lake bed and then fly off. And he said, well, let me see the footage, because it was film at that time. He looked at it, sure enough, the film had exactly what they had described. He reported it up. They said, we're gonna have a courier come pick that film up. The courier came and picked it up, and he never saw it again, nor could he find out where it went. Here's a little bit of footage. So up until now, this has been the only footage that exists of that UN event. But James Fox, a documentary filmmaker who's working with Lee Spiegel, actually were able to get all of the footage from this. So his upcoming documentary will include some, and they'll be releasing the rest real soon. And there's going to be some really exciting stuff in there, such as this witness here. This is Army Lieutenant Colonel Larry Coyne. He had an event that happened in 1973 when him and his Army helicopter crew had a terrifying close encounter. They experienced this object. They were flying on about 11 p.m. on October 18th in 1973. They were flying out of Columbus, Ohio, when their crew spotted a red light on the horizon. They were near an Army National Guard base that housed jets, but they verified that none of the jets were in the air. They were cruising at about 15 to 2,500 feet when they first saw this object. The light then sped towards them at over 600 knots. He went into a dive because he thought that this thing was going to crash into them. Luckily it didn't, but he noticed that instead of diving, as he tried to dive, his aircraft went up into the sky up to 3,500 feet. There was no noise or turbulence. The craft just rose. Now this is something that should be in Project Blue Book. Maybe it will be, because the truth is stranger than fiction. But they said that the object was shaped like an airfoil or a fat cigar. There was a red light on one end, a center dome, and then a green light at the rear. That is what he said it swiveled like a spotlight, and it was what hit them and lit up everything green as they kind of just floated up into the air. It then finally moved off and flew off into the horizon. So he was there at the UN to talk about this. Here's the group here. Again, here's Stanton Friedman, who unfortunately passed away in the last year. Very important UFO researcher. He was a good friend. And back then he had a suit that looked kind of like a couch that I used to have. My parents had when I was born, actually. But here is Jacques Vallée, who we've been talking about, and Sir Eric Gary, and there's my friend Lee right there. So the United Nations did not pass this as a resolution, but they did pass it, a watered-down version, as what they call a decision, and it's still on the books. It's called Decision 33-426-1978, and essentially what they did was invite any countries that wanted to send UFO files to the United Nations, and they would take a look at it and dispense those throughout the other governments. They also said they would forward this to the Space Committee to take a look. However, Sir Eric Gary, who was essentially the only guy pushing this, was deposed. There was a coup in Grenada, and so he wasn't in the UN anymore, so he couldn't push this initiative, so it didn't go anywhere after that. But it's still on the books, and people, especially like Bermudez and some of these others, are saying we need to go back to the UN, we need to really get all of this rolling. Now, it's important to note that, the country was not embarrassed by Sir Eric Gary and his UFO interests. Actually, they were very proud of him. This is some stamps that they have. Eric Gary eventually was able to go back to Grenada, and he was considered a hero for the rest of his life. He was very beloved by the Grenadans, and they were not happy with the coup that happened in the country. And that coup was overturned, I think, within the year. So yeah, so the UN has had conversations about this. At least these are the ones that we know about. So those are the organizations, CEPA, GEIPAN, some of these others, the UN, and what's interesting is, just kind of the debate, where do we go from here? Especially here in the United States, if we continue investigating, will that go under our space? Will NASA begin to do this, like GEIPAN? Probably not. Actually, some of you may know, Jimmy Carter asked them to do that, and they respectfully declined. CEPA under the military, that's kind of where it seems to be right now at the Pentagon, that they're investigating this stuff. Of course, the military is very secretive, so it's amazing that we're finding these things out now. And I'll be talking about that in just a few minutes, because really, we shouldn't have known. If it wasn't for Lou Elizondo coming out and telling us, and if it wasn't for this rock star who helped make that happen, which is what I'm going to tell you about in my next lecture, none of that would have happened. So we'll see how things go forward, and I think it's important to examine, how these other countries have tackled this subject, and the UN, so we know how to move forward, and that we have precedence in some of these areas. My website, openminds.tv. You can find me also at alejandrotrojas.com. I also help organize and I MC the International UFO Congress, and I have a mostly weekly podcast called Open Minds UFO Radio at openminds.tv. Thank you so much for being here, and I hope you stick around for the next time.